And this is an enzyme that cuts proteins. Okay, so it's a protease. When you say protease, that's an enzyme that hydrolyzes proteins. And it happens at a particular peptide bond, and you can look it up. I don't remember it anymore, and I don't ask you guys to remember it. But just so you know, all the proteases that we talk about here will recognize a specific sequence of amino acids. Like you have ones that cut between lysine and arginine, you know, that kind of thing. They're specific. And you can look up the specificity. Back when I worked in a lab and I had to use that for something, I knew it, but there's really no reason to memorize it. Okay, so pepsin is secreted in its inactive form, which we call pepsinogen. The term for an inactive enzyme in this form is called a zymogen. Okay, a zymogen. Fibrinogen is a zymogen. Pepsinogen is a zymogen. Okay. We'll see this zymogen concept come up in the digestive system a lot. Because we want to secrete the enzyme out into the lumen, but we don't want to use it yet. Okay? We want it to be out there waiting for when something actually needs to be digested. Okay? So the signal that tells the stomach that we're going to digest something is a drop in pH. Okay? When the pH in the lumen goes down, that means that there's something going on and we're going to digest something. Okay? It's the result of parasympathetic stimulation to the stomach, which we'll talk about here in a bit. All right, so a drop in pH means the stomach is becoming more acidic, which probably is happening because we're producing what? The parietal cells are producing hydrochloric acid. Okay. It's a drop in pH that turns pepsinogen into pepsin, okay, by acid hydrolysis. Okay. The little end of pepsinogen is actually cut off, and that converts pepsinogen into the active pepsin. Okay, so acid hydrolysis of pepsinogen converts pepsinogen to pepsin. And why are we having acid hydrolysis? Because the pH of the stomach has gone down in response to secretion of hydrochloric acid. Now, if you didn't follow any of that, or you look at your notes and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, ask. Okay. Got it?
pH goes down because hydrochloric acid is produced.
Yep. And the drop in pH does what?
Converts pepsinogen into pepsin.
Yep.
Okay.
You got it. Okay.
Okay. Now I have it.
Then we can enter into a positive feedback cycle because pepsin will actually work on other pepsinogen molecules and activate them. So once we've activated some pepsin, then we kind of get the ball rolling. It's a positive feedback, and then the activated pepsin will actually go cleave pepsinogen molecules into pepsin. Okay. So that speeds it up even more. So a little drop in pH is going to pretty much, in a domino-like effect, activate all of our pepsinogen to pepsin. Okay. And now pepsin is going to act on the proteins that we've eaten and aid that denaturation process. Okay, so here we've started lipid digestion. We're denaturing proteins. And we've inactivated a lot of bacteria and viruses that have come into the stomach. And pretty much that's what the stomach does. Okay? Missed anything? No, that's about it. Vitamin B12 doesn't get absorbed in the stomach. It just, intrinsic factor solubilizes it. Most of it gets absorbed in the duodenum and in the jejunum. A couple of things will get absorbed in the stomach. Okay? Some lipid-soluble molecules will. Probably most notably, two things that get absorbed in the stomach: alcohol and aspirin. Okay? Those are two things that actually get directly absorbed right in the stomach. Okay? Aspirin, you can even, if you can stomach it, that's a bad term, if you can stand it, you can actually dissolve an aspirin in your mouth. Okay? And you put an aspirin under your tongue and you'll dissolve that right there in the oral cavity. Now it's extremely bitter, and so it actually kind of hurts if you do that. But if you need to get aspirin into somebody's system very quickly and they can't swallow, you can just put it in their mouth, a little bit of saliva, and it'll dissolve in there and get absorbed. Okay. But alcohol can get absorbed in the stomach, which is why you can get tipsy so darn quick. Okay, you don't have to wait for the alcohol to get into your intestines. Okay, some other cells that we have in here, if we come back and look, the ones that are in green here, these are enteroendocrine cells. Enteroendocrine. I don't really care that you tell me the whole name is enteroendocrine. Entero just means digestive tract. I'm concerned with the endocrine idea. Okay, these are endocrine cells. Endocrine cells produce hormones, right? Okay. So one of the essays you're going to be asked to do on Monday to choose from is list the digestive secretions of the GI tract. Now, the last 4 things we've gone over, plus mucus, should all be listed for the stomach. Okay. This one should not be. Okay. These are not digestive secretions. These don't go into the lumen. The endocrine secretions go into the gastric capillaries. They go into the blood. Okay, so that's not a gastric secretion per se. That's not for digestion. That's regulatory. Okay.
So we are not going to mention that?
No, you are, but that's if you do the other essay. The other essay is talking about how gastric secretions are regulated. Okay? The regulation essay is much shorter than the other one, but it's more complicated. You know, it's anytime you have a feedback mechanism and different regulatory things, that's a little more complicated. So you can choose the more complicated, less writing path, or you choose the much simpler but more writing. Okay, one or the other. And I'll go over and I'll sum up the entire regulatory pathway separately. Okay. So for now, I'm going to mention something here, and we'll see who remembers it later. The main secretion coming from these enteroendocrine cells within the stomach is histamine. Okay? Histamine. And another hormone called gastrin. Okay. Histamine and gastrin.
Do they excrete those?
Yeah, they do, but they excrete them into the, well, not really excrete, but secrete, into the capillaries, into the bloodstream. Histamine and gastrin stimulate parietal cells to produce acid. Both. Yeah. As it turns out, histamine has the strongest effect. Histamine is the most powerful elicitor of gastric secretion of the different hormones. Okay. Gastrin also stimulates contraction of the smooth muscle of the stomach, so it makes the stomach churn. So this begs the obvious question: what stimulates the what stimulates or activates the enteroendocrine cells to secrete these hormones? Okay. And the answer to that is really twofold. Okay. One, well, in all cases, it's nervous stimulation. It's the result of parasympathetic stimulation. Okay. Parasympathetic stimulation to these enteroendocrine cells cause them to secrete the hormones. Okay. There are 2 ways we can get that parasympathetic stimulation. One is what we call the enteric reflex. So if we stretch the walls of the stomach, that stretching activates the parasympathetic side of the enteric nerve plexus. So that's a reflex. You stretch the stomach distension activates the parasympathetic ENS, enteric nerve system. And that leads to the release of gastrin and histamine. So what we're saying here is that you put food into the stomach and it stretches the stomach, that's going to go ahead and reflexively increase acid and chief cell production. Okay? But that would only work when you put food in the stomach. You actually start lowering the pH of your stomach even before you put any food in it. And that's something we call the cephalic phase of digestion. Okay? If you just think about eating, okay?
You gain 5 pounds.
Explains everything.
Yeah, that's me. I tell my wife I'm actually photosynthetic. I go out in the sun and I just manufacture carbohydrate.
Explains everything.
When you think about eating, that activates the parasympathetic reflexes of the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve then stimulates the enteric nerve network. Okay? Remember, the vagus nerve is the only cranial nerve that leaves the head. Okay? And it takes parasympathetic impulses down to your organs. And so when it goes to the stomach, it activates the ENS just like the stretch would. And so the types of things that activate this vagal response, the gastric vagal response, are things like aromas, food aromas, okay, or just thinking about eating, you know. So if you eat dinner at 5:30 at night and you leave work at 5 and you're driving home, you're thinking about getting ready for dinner. By the time you hit the door, you're ravenously hungry. You know, you might not have been all that hungry when you left work, but you're used to eating at that time. Brain knows it, you know, whether you're consciously aware of it or not, it's gearing up to eat. And then you show up and it's like, oh, you know, you find out something happened and you got to go rush off here and you don't eat for 2 more hours. You feel pretty miserable because your stomach got all ready for that meal, you know. And the pH went way down, and it's going to actually sit there and digest the mucosal lining because you didn't put any food in there, you know. And then a couple hours later, the pH will come back up, you know, and then you can eat at another time. If you do that habitually, that causes stomach problems. You know, if you go really long fasting periods and kind of, you know, get it ready to eat, but then don't feed it, that's not good. Okay. Okay. So the cephalic phase is just thinking about it. That increases what we would call efferent action potentials in the vagus nerve. Right? Efferent means going out. That's motor output. That is parasympathetic. The vagus nerve just carries parasympathetic motor output. To the ENS. Remember what ENS is? I've said it a few times, but I want to make sure you all know what it is. Enteric nerve system. Enteric nervous system. And that's all parasympathetic. So that goes ahead and stimulates the enteroendocrine cells to secrete what? Histamine and gastrin, right. And not into the lumen, but into the bloodstream. Right? Where then, in a positive feedback mechanism, causes the parietal cells, and to a limited extent the chief cells, to upregulate their secretions. Okay. So here, now we've got the stomach churning, producing acid, so we're doing what the stomach's supposed to do. And eventually, after, say, half an hour to maybe 2 hours, it pushes that food down into the pylorus of the stomach. Okay? And so we know what the pylorus is, right? Well, that stretches the pylorus. Well, when we stretch the pylorus, we actually have exactly the opposite happen. Stretching of the pylorus inhibits the ENS. Okay? Stretching of the pylorus inhibits the ENS. So that means we're going to decrease our histamine and gastrin secretion. So as we're getting ready to move the food out of the stomach, we go ahead and stop making acid. Okay, enough of that. We're done with that.
So stretching inhibits the enteroendocrine
Glands. Yeah, of the pylorus. So while we're in the body in the fundus, it activates it. By the time we get to the duodenum, it's inhibiting it. And when food enters into the pylorus, that same stretching is what activates the pyloric sphincter to open. So once the pylorus is full of food, the pyloric sphincter relaxes and we push the food into the small intestine. It's called gastric dumping or gastric emptying. There was one other thing I was going to tell you about that. Well, there's 2 ways we stimulate it. Okay? So the one is that enteric reflex, where we stretch the stomach. So stomach distension will activate the ENS. And then the other one was the cephalic, where we actually just think about it, and that's vagal stimulation. Vagal stimulation. Oh, yeah. This was just a term I wanted to make sure I mentioned. When we chew up the food in the mouth, when we liquefy it, we call that a bolus, right? And that's what we swallow. We swallow a bolus of food. When it goes down into the stomach and it's mixed with the gastric contents, now we call it a chemical called chyme. C-H-Y-M-E. So the mucoid food bolus, once it's mixed in the stomach with the acid, that's called acidic chyme. Acidic chyme. If you regurgitate the chyme into the esophagus, that's what can eventually erode away the esophagus and give you esophageal ulcerations. Now we're going to pass that acidic chyme into the duodenum.